I'm delighted to welcome you this morning. My name is Nancy Lindborg. I'm the president of the United States Institute of Peace, and I'm very glad to be gathered here and co-hosting this event today with the Wilson Center. I'd like to acknowledge my good colleague, Andrew Seeley, the executive vice president of the Wilson Center. And USIP and the Wilson Center have a long history of collaborating together. Some of you may have seen the work of the wonderful journalist Robin Wright. We in the Wilson Center co-host her. She's a joint fellow at both of our institutions, and we share publications of the comprehensive web resources, the Iran Primer. And so this event today continues that tradition, and today's discussion will be moderated by Henri Barkey, the director of the Middle East program here at the Wilson Center. And it is my distinct honor today to be able to welcome His Excellency Qubad Talabani, who's the Deputy Prime Minister of the Kurdistan Regional Government. I had the great pleasure to see him during my visit to the Kurdistan region last year, where we had an opportunity to talk about a number of the pressing issues that I'm sure he'll talk about today. I'd also like to welcome members of the KRG delegation who have joined him here in Washington, including Karim Sinjari, who's the Minister of the Interior, and the Acting Minister of Peshmerga, and also His Excellency Falah Mustafa Bakir, who's the head of the KRG's Department of Foreign Relations. Gentlemen, good to see you both here today. Also, Bayan Abdul Rahman, who's the KRG representative to the United States. Wonderful to have you with us. I would like to just briefly note that today also marks the anniversary of the 1988 Anfal genocide operations that were perpetrated under Saddam Hussein. So we are here on a day that holds great significance for our colleagues in the Kurdistan region. And I would just like to note that it underscores how important it is for all of us to understand the ways in which we can avoid conflict from becoming violent. USIP was founded 30 years ago by Congress as a nonpartisan, independent federal institution dedicated to the proposition that peace is possible, that it's practical, and that it is essential both for U.S. and global security, and that we pursue this vision of a world without violent conflict by working to equip people at the individual, community, national, and regional level with the tools and the information and the approaches for how to manage conflict so it doesn't become violent and to resolve it when it does. And we have been working in and with Iraq for over a decade. It's a priority for USIP. And with the support of our Iraqi and our American partners, we have maintained a permanent office since 2004 and an office in Erbil since 2013. So we're here today at a time when Iraq, the Kurdistan region, and the whole Middle East is confronting enormous challenges. And the Kurdistan region, which has long been an island of stability in the Middle East, is now affected by this conflict, and it faces significant economic and political roadblocks that threaten that important stability. And I'm sure we'll hear more today about the impact of the decline of oil price on the finances of the region, and at a time when they are also hosting somewhere between 1 and 1.8 million displaced people. We hear a lot about the 60 million people who are historically displaced globally, and the Kurdistan region is hosting many of them. And when I was in Erbil, I was very struck by the fact that 1 in 5 people right now in the Kurdistan region is displaced. USIP remains committed to working with partners on the ground. We've trained KRG civilian and security personnel. And I would just note also the importance of complementing all of our support there with a focus on reconciliation. And through our Iraqi partners at Synod for Peace Building and the Network for Iraqi Facilitators, we've seen the power of negotiating local peace. We saw the ability to negotiate local peace in the aftermath of the 2014 massacre at Camp Speicher near Tikrit in the aftermath of Daesh being there. So these kinds of local reconciliations connected up to national efforts for dialogue and reconciliation are absolutely key, especially for a future that is peaceful in an enduring manner for Iraq. So I know that many of you here are very well acquainted with Deputy Prime Minister Qubad Talabani. He was in Washington for many years as an exceptional representative of the KRG. He served as the minister and the head of the Department of Coordination and Follow-up, where Mr. Talabani led a newly formed governmental department designated as the KRG's principal policy unit. He brings extraordinary energy and acumen to an important job in an important time. So we're delighted to have him here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Talabani.
Thank you, Nancy. And on behalf of the Wilson Center, I also would like to welcome Qubad Talabani here. And we've known each other for a very long time. I don't want to waste too much of your time. So first, Qubad will speak, and then I have a few questions for him, and then I will open up the session to questions from the audience. Qubad,
thank you, Henri. Thank you, Nancy, for the introduction. I'd like to thank the USIP and the Woodrow Wilson Center for coming together to host me here today, and to thank you all for your help and your cooperation, coordination with us over the years. And I would like to take this opportunity to ask that we all together stand in a moment of silence for the people who were victims of Saddam's genocide of the Anfal. Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. I look forward to a good and lively discussion with my good and longtime friend, Henri. But before maybe we get into some of your questions, a little bit about why we're here, why we're visiting Washington, what our message has been to our friends in the government, in Congress, and in other policy centers around the United States. We're here to remind people, to remind friends that 28 years ago there was the Anfal against the Kurds. April is also the month that marks the 25th anniversary of Operation Provide Comfort, which really led to a period of peace and stability and prosperity and development in Kurdistan. But at the same time, 25 years after a safe haven was established, and 25 years after we were allowed to live with a degree of stability, we held our parliamentary elections and formed our Kurdistan regional government and went through a very rocky road towards self-governance and self-administration. That 25 years later, we still are living in an area that is riddled with war. We still have Kurds that are displaced. We have people 25 years later still living in tents, this time not as a result of Ba'athist nationalism but of Daesh brutality. We have just witnessed a modern-day genocide again against the Yazidis, this time Christians, Shabaks, and other communities in Iraq. So while so much has changed in Kurdistan over the last 25 years, so much development has happened, so much progress has been made, that 25 years later we are still insecure about our future. We are still living with a high degree of uncertainty, surrounded by enemies and facing many challenges. And we are today facing many significant and simultaneous challenges in Kurdistan. We are at war, this time against a very brutal and merciless enemy in Daesh. We are, as Nancy rightly said, housing 1.8 million internally displaced people and refugees, displaced from within Iraq and refugees from Syria. We're in the in a country that is embroiled with continuous political turmoil and political instability, in a region that has not been stable for a very long time, and I think we're commiserating or commemorating 100 years of Sykes-Picot as well. But the existential threat to Kurdistan today is not a war with ISIS. It is not the stress of housing all of these internally displaced people and refugees. It's not even the political turmoil facing the country and Kurdistan. The number one threat facing Kurdistan today, the existential threat facing Kurdistan today, is the state of our economy. And Kurdistan's economy, while booming for much of the post-Saddam period, had suffered multiple shocks that has left us in a very difficult situation today. The first shock that hit our system was in 2014 when when Prime Minister Maliki, a little Freudian slip there. A little Freudian slip there, excuse me. When Prime Minister Maliki cut the budget transfers to the Kurdistan region. A few months after that, we had the influx of ISIS and the war against ISIS, which led to the refugees and the IDPs. And compounding these shocks to our system and these shocks to our economy was the rapid global drop in oil prices. This has left us reeling right now. You add to that a oversized government that we have, oil rents that we were dispersing and was easy to disperse when oil was $100 a barrel, a very large social safety net that we had in Kurdistan, huge public sector employment and an overly dependence on a public sector. And today, all of these factors have contributed to this threat facing Kurdistan today. And it's not a threat that is facing Kurdistan specifically, it's a threat facing every single commodity economy, including Iraq and many others in the region. But what makes us different to some of these other countries that are having the same fallout from the drop in oil prices is that we're not a country. So as a sub-sovereign, we don't have the levers to manage our economy in the way that a sovereign country does. We are not in charge of monetary policy, so we cannot print, we cannot devalue. We are already significantly in debt, and it's very expensive for us to go out and get into more debt to issue international bonds or even domestic bonds. At the same time, when other countries have faced economic and financial crises, there's been a rapid rush to help them in the form of bailouts. We've seen it in Turkey, we saw it in Greece, we've seen it in other areas. We haven't had a massive rush of friendly countries or international organizations to come and bail us out of our economic situation. So we're only left with fiscal management tools as a government, which we've been able to use to balance our budget to the best that we can. And the other tool that we have at our disposal is reform. And we've started a comprehensive reform package to restructure our government, to reform our Ministry of Finance, to remove overbearing subsidies on fuel, and to extract the government from certain sectors such as electricity and other sectors where the public sector is very dominant. But these two tools are only making a very minimal impact to our whole in our economy, which is why it's important for our friends around the world to realize that this threat facing Kurdistan is grave, this threat facing Kurdistan is real, and without immediate direct support, the experiment of Kurdistan is in danger, but more troubling, the front line against ISIS is in danger. Because the current economic crisis facing Kurdistan has resulted in us not being able to meet our salary obligations. Civil servants, civilians in our government have not been paid. We're 4 months in arrears to payments to our civilians in our government. We're 3 months in arrears to payments to our soldiers who have been valiantly defending the front lines. We've suffered 1,400 casualties in this war against ISIS and have had well over 8,000 people injured in this war against ISIS. So anything that could weaken this front line, anything that could potentially harm the morale of our troops is not only a danger to Kurdistan, it's a danger to Iraq, it's a danger to the region, it's a danger to the global war against ISIS. So it's imperative that people come and realize that Kurdistan is in danger right now. And just like how 25 years ago the international community convened to protect Kurdistan, allow our people safe passage down from the mountains, we are again, regrettably, coming to the international community to seek your support once again, to come help us in this time as we begin to rebuild our economy, to ensure that our war against ISIS remains strong, that our progress in the war against ISIS remains, and that we can continue to hold Kurdistan up as a success story in an otherwise troubled Middle East. That message is, we're happy that I think on this week we've heard that there is a much broader, growing sense of understanding of our situation, that there is an appreciation of the efforts that we have made to begin our reforms. Yes, we should have started these reforms years ago, but there's two times to carry out reforms, years ago or today. We've picked today, and we've started, and we're serious, but we need your help. And I want to thank you for this opportunity, and I'm sure we can get into some of the more detailed elements during our Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Qubad. Let me start with an easy question.
Oh, I'm always worried when somebody says, let me start with an easy question.
You mentioned essentially the 100th year anniversary of Sykes-Picot, which we're all very interested here. But here's, in the 100th anniversary of Sykes-Picot, President Barzani has announced that he would like to have a referendum on independence in Kurdistan. And you're facing all these crises. You have ISIS, you have the financial crisis, as you said, which is existential. And let's assume that the referendum goes forward and the people of Kurdistan overwhelmingly support it. Then what? What happens the day after? And suppose Iraq decides this really never happened. The government of Iraq completely ignores it. So what happens? Can you walk us through a little bit what the aim is?
Sure. I think there's absolutely no doubting the natural right of Kurds to be independent, to have an independent country. We have lived through the most horrible crimes committed against us because we're Kurdish. We've been persecuted politically and recently economically because we're Kurdish. We've proven that despite our differences and our difficulties and our shortcomings, that we can provide a relatively successful form of governance that is tolerant and plural. So there is no doubt in, I think, the majority of Kurds' minds that we should be independent, whether it's today, tomorrow, a year from now, or 10 years from now. But independence is a process. Independence is not a decision. It's not an emotional decision. It's not a knee-jerk reaction. It's a process, and that process has to start with a conversation. And that process has to start with a conversation first amongst ourselves, among the people who are seeking independence. And a conversation has to be an honest conversation. It has to be a deep conversation. It has to be a conversation where we have to weigh up all the pros and cons and the threats and the opportunities of this decision. At the same time, it's a process that requires a conversation with the country that we're currently a part of, and that's Iraq. It's a process that will require a conversation with countries that we're currently neighbored to, Turkey and Iran in particular. Syria has its own complications right now. So I think that the calls for a referendum and the growing talk of independence shouldn't worry our friends in the United States. It shouldn't worry our friends in the region. It may, but it shouldn't. And it shouldn't worry our colleagues in Baghdad. I think this is a time to have a conversation, to have a discussion about this topic. And our sense is that this topic is no longer taboo. Before, it was unspeakable for somebody to come to Washington and use the I word. It was. Today, we're openly having this discussion. And this process will take time. This process has to be thought through. But this process has begun.
So are you saying the conversation has to take place before the referendum, or it takes place after the referendum?
Both. It's a strategic decision that determines the fate and future of millions of people. So it's a decision that nobody is taking lightly. And even a referendum is a process. Even holding a referendum is a process. It requires legal actions, it requires technical issues, it requires us fine-tuning the question or questions that would come up in the referendum. And there is still some work to do before we can go through all of the elements of this process that is required to hold a referendum, and then the what-ifs that will come after a referendum.
But granted, you have, as you said, an existential challenge in your economy. You have ISIS as your neighbor now. So isn't this a distraction, the referendum, from much more presumably important issues?
I'm not distracted from my role, and our government is not distracted in its role in fighting ISIS, in trying to fix our economic woes, in trying to fix our political difficulties, and trying to fix the issues in Baghdad, and trying to fix the issues in Kurdistan. Maybe the media is can make something larger, smaller, and change people's focus on certain issues, but I don't see this as a distraction. I see this as a natural right and of our people, but again, it's a process, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight.
Let me draw you to Mosul. Here's Iraq's second largest city, very close to your territory. It's been occupied by ISIS now since June 2014. It's going to be almost 2 years in a couple of months. Nothing has happened in Mosul. So can you talk a little bit elaborate how you see the situation developing with respect to Mosul? If you were asked what to do in Mosul, what would you suggest? What would be especially a plan for the day after, given the fact that how Mosul is important to both Iraq's well-being and also to your well-being?
Well, I think there are two components to, I think I'd say there's three components to Mosul. One is Mosul the province, Mosul the city, and then you have the military plan to liberate Mosul, and then the political plan to govern Mosul the day after. And I don't think any one of those plans are particularly concrete right now. Militarily, we are certain that our American friends are working diligently on formulating a plan. I think they're doing this in close cooperation with the Iraqi government. I'm not sure who's drafting the plan, it's the Iraqi government or the US military, but we're expecting a plan to be presented very soon. We are requesting as a potential component, a very likely component to this plan, that this plan be very well thought through, that we have a very clear understanding of who's going to play what role in this plan, and what the chain of command structure is for any military operations to liberate Mosul, and what the steps are in this plan, and how can we ensure that there are no surprises as the military portion of the plan unfolds. But Mosul is not just must not be just a military operation, because Mosul is not like Ramadi, it's not like Tikrit, it's not like some of the other important towns and cities that have been liberated from Daesh. Mosul is the second largest city. It's a multi-ethnic and multi-religious city. It's a city fraught with its own social challenges. And therefore there needs to be a comprehensive plan for Mosul the day after, the governance of Mosul, the politics of Mosul, and this in turn also represents a plan for a post-ISIS Iraq and a post-ISIS world, because ISIS is not just, again, a military threat, and ISIS did not just fill a military vacuum in Iraq. ISIS filled a political vacuum in the country. So how can we ensure that if the coalition, Iraq and Kurds, if we eliminate every single ISIS combatant, how do we ensure that there is not another mutation? Because ISIS is a mutation of various other radical groups that have spawned throughout the last decade or so. So how do we ensure that once all of this effort, and again an international coalition, and again airstrikes and boots on the ground, that clear Iraq from a radical group, does not in the future create another group? So we have to fix the politics of Iraq too. And that, I think, is a less tangible and less kinetic action that really needs to be given greater thought. And I don't see the discussion inside Iraq being at the level it needs to be to ensure that in a post-ISIS Iraq, we can have a degree of harmony between the various components of Iraq that would ensure that another group like this does not come and try to represent a community in the country.
So in effect, you're saying, since when you look at ISIS's success in Mosul at the beginning, it was partially driven by the fact that it made coalitions with some of the tribes. It just did not completely fight its way in. It had support. So you need to come up with a political plan, but you're saying that nothing of the sort is in play at the moment. Hence, we should not expect a Mosul liberated this year, next year?
It depends how the planners are looking at this. I mean, I remember, we all remember the surge, right? The three-step plan to the surge in Iraq: clear, hold, build, I think is the three steps. So the US upped its troop presence in the country. They worked with local tribes. They armed certain tribes, and they cleared Iraq from Al-Qaeda in Iraq at the time. They killed Zarqawi, they killed Abu Umar Baghdadi, they killed a whole host of other successors to Zarqawi. But there was no holding, and then there was no building. And the reason why there was no holding and there was no building, because I remember very clearly at the time, generals like General Petraeus and others who were kind of leading the counterinsurgency strategy were talking about the military is there to create space for politics to grow. Well, the politics never grew. And we never addressed the root cause of the issues then, which is why, after the surge, Prime Minister Maliki took the credit for it, and the promises that were made to the Sunni communities and those others that were disenfranchised by actions of the federal government were never really addressed. Which is why a few years before ISIS came into Mosul, when there were demonstrations in Anbar, there was no ISIS in the picture. There were people demonstrating, calling for their rights, calling for better services, calling for better governance and greater participation. But those calls fell on deaf ears, and hence the crack was formed that allowed ISIS to come and fill that void. And that's why I am not aware of extensive discussions, political discussions, on a post-ISIS Iraq, and how do we ensure that the Sunnis of Iraq are represented by real representatives and not groups like ISIS.
So would you recommend another federation emerge in Iraq for the Sunnis?
It's not for me to recommend that. It's for the Sunnis to recommend that. But then the Sunnis have to be effectively represented by themselves in this discussion. And I don't mean this as any disrespect to any of the Sunni political figures in Iraq or any of the political parties that claim to be representing Sunni interests, but they haven't been effective in representing Sunni interests. It's clear who represents the Kurds of Iraq, it's clear who represents the Shiites of Iraq, but it's never been clear who really represents the Sunnis of Iraq at a political level, at a strategic level, inside Baghdad, or also in the communities. Maybe it's the tribes. Who knows?
Thank you, Qubad. Let me open it up to questions. Please wait for the microphone, and when you get it, identify yourself. Yes. The gentleman there, David.
Dave Ottaway from the Woodrow Wilson Center. I wonder if you could tell us exactly what your oil production is now, what your income from production is, and where you hope to go in your oil production. At one point you were headed for 1 million barrels by early next year. I don't know if that's still true, but can you tell us a little bit about what's happening in the oil sector?
Sure. So our oil sector has grown dramatically really over the last 3 or 4 years in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of our fields that have come online. We just at the time that we started independent exports in May of 2014 is when we first started exporting through our then newly built pipeline. We were able to ramp up production quite quickly. At the peak times, we were selling about 18 million barrels oil per month, which again at $30 a barrel, at $25 a barrel, was not bringing us the level of income that we had initially thought we were going to get when we were planning for this several years before. So we have a pipeline capacity right now in Kurdistan of about 700,000 barrels. That's our capacity to export. That doesn't necessarily mean we are exporting 700,000 barrels a day. We have had a recent complication with our colleagues in the North Oil Company in Kirkuk, where they have shut off the Kirkuk fields, so 150,000 barrels of Kirkuk oil that was flowing through our pipeline is no longer flowing through our pipeline, which is causing again another major dent to our revenue streams. But we also have to take into consideration the payments to the international oil companies that has to come from the sale of oil. So all in all, the plan that we had to reach this level of export, we've been able to hit our targets, but nobody was able to take into consideration the drastic and dramatic fall of oil prices, unfortunately.
What about gas?
Gas, we have a lot of prospect gas in Kurdistan. We have some gas now that is being produced in Kurdistan. We're primarily powering our power stations using that natural gas, but our plan is to be able to export our excess gas out of Kurdistan. But right now we're in the process of switching from diesel as a source to power our power stations to natural gas, which is obviously much cleaner and, more importantly, much cheaper for us. Last year we had about 50% of our power was produced by natural gas. Today about 75% of the fuel that's used to power Kurdistan is natural gas. So we're trying to get to 100% by the end of the year. And once we've been able to secure the power of Kurdistan using natural gas, then of course we'll be open for exports.
Yes, gentleman here.
My name is Bob Kelly, and in 2006, I was chief counsel of the National Security Subcommittee, and you were a very articulate witness at our hearings on Iraq. Today, I represent the National Mobilization Force in outside of Mosul, and that is a Sunni force. Just last week, the U.S. Special Forces completed and issued certificates of training to the 200 members of the National Mobilization Force. And last May, Athil al-Nujafi, who is the leader of the National Mobilization Force, spoke at the Brookings Institution, and he called for autonomy from Baghdad for the Sunni province of Nineveh, much like Kurdistan.
Can you get to the question, please?
Yes. What is your view on autonomy for Sunnis?
Now that's a softball question. Look, we think Iraq is a federal country. The Constitution of Iraq defines Iraq as a federal country. There are laws that have been passed by the Parliament of Iraq that determine how regions could be created similar to those in Kurdistan. So it's something that ideologically we have absolutely no problems with. And in fact, we've long believed that the way that Iraq can remain a country is through decentralization, is through an administrative structure that actually reflects the fragmented society. Rather than having an administrative structure that is at odds with the country. You know, we've others, the US and others have long sought to try to keep Iraq together by empowering a central government, which has actually had the opposite effect of making people live together, because whoever's been in charge in Baghdad has not necessarily used that power very fairly and has disenfranchised different communities. Yesterday was the Kurds, today is the Sunnis. Even Basrawis today in the south are very upset and annoyed and frustrated with the incompetence of the federal government. They're calling for greater autonomy, calling for decentralization. So I don't think, it's again, there's been this very negative connotation associated with federalism, even by some here that in the US who live in I believe, a federal country. So I think we need to dispel this notion that federalism is evil and is going to cause the breakup of Iraq. In fact, centralization, in my opinion, is wrong and is going to ultimately lead to the breakup of Iraq.
Good.
Rudy?
Yeah, this gentleman.
Hi, Chrisman Smith. I'm an independent researcher with USURF. Going back to the independence question, if we assume that Iraqi Kurdistan does go independent in the near future, I wonder if you could comment on what steps and measures we can expect the Kurdish government to take with regards to minorities and non-Kurds. Thank you.
Well, regardless of independence and the independence issue, we've long had a very public and actually a position that we've carried out in practice of being supportive of all communities in Iraq and in Kurdistan in particular. That's the Christian community, the other religious and ethnic communities, Turkmens and others. So, and even in the draft constitution of Kurdistan, there are strong provisions that ensure the protection of their rights, their religious beliefs, their ethnic identity, and participation in government and in parliament. So I think regardless of the independence issue, you will always see Kurdistan as a supporter of all of the different communities in the country. We were the first to, even before, throughout the 2006 and onwards, when Christian churches were being bombed in Baghdad and Basra, we were taking in thousands of Christian families, and the tolerance of Kurdistan today and the openness of our population to take in all of these displaced people, I think, is a testament to our people. It's a testament to our culture, which is open and tolerant and very forthcoming.
You have a very specific question from a friend of yours, Ambirin Zaman, who's a scholar here. She's I think in the overflow room, so I got her question.
You didn't let her in here as well?
Yes. So she's asked whether the leadership vacuum in the PUK and the burgeoning influence of the PKK in Suleimania province especially is seen as a major obstacle to any consensus on moving forward to independence. Without a clear leadership in the PUK, who will the KDP talk to and reach a consensus with?
I don't know if there's a leadership vacuum in the PUK. There's leadership issues within the PUK, and I would also disagree with Ambirin's assertion that there's burgeoning PKK influence in Suleimania. So I don't think that Obviously, the PUK has gone through political challenges. Its founder and its leader and its source of strength, Jalal Talabani, was debilitated with a heavy stroke. So that is undoubtedly going to impact a party that has depended on one person's charisma and leadership. So, having said that, the party stayed strong, and the party's always been somewhat fractured. It was actually formed by different groups coming together, so a little bit of rivalry is kind of normal in PUK politics, and my Kurdish colleagues in the audience can attest to that. I see some PUK people here in the audience. So I think that's just a normal thing. I think it's quite clear who the other political parties in Kurdistan talk to, who they need to talk to when they're communicating and when they're negotiating key issues with.
Yes, Trudy. No, the lady behind.
Trudy.
Yeah.
Hi, Trudy Rubin, the Philadelphia Inquirer. I wonder if you could say specifically a little more about what kind of financial help you're looking for on this trip to Washington, what specifics, both civilian and military, and whether you feel you're getting or going to get any more response than you did the last time officials came from the KRG and were raising the same issues.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. In fact, just to give you a size of the scale of our problem in Kurdistan. So at the start of this year, we were dealing with an operating deficit to the tune of $400 million per month. This was devastating for us. We carried out some very harsh austerity measures and implemented a painful withholding of civil servant salaries that was able to slash about 40% off our wage bill per month. So we've been able to get that deficit down from about $400 million per month to around $100 million per month. Now, that is a big drop in the size of the deficit, but at the same time, $100 million a month is still $100 million a month, and that's a very big hole to plug. So if it continues at this rate, then eventually we're going to start falling behind again in paying civil servant salaries, and that's something that we are desperately trying to avoid because we've built some trust now with our public in selling them these pay cuts. Is that we will pay our salaries on time. So we're doing everything we can to keep paying our salaries on time, and that's why financial assistance that can help us plug that deficit will be vital to keeping social order, but also our governance functioning. At the same time, we understand that there are several pots of money available, both here in the US and also internationally. There's the Defense Department funds for counter-ISIL operations. Well, nobody's countering ISIL as effectively as we are on the ground, so it makes perfect sense for us to benefit from counter-ISIL funds that are being appropriated by your Congress and managed by the Defense Department. Economic support funds is another natural avenue for the KRG to receive economic support funds from the United States. At the same time, we're not just looking to the United States to support us in this effort. We've reached out to European capitals around the world, have pitched our case to them. And this week, it's the Spring Summit. The IMF, the finance ministers from around the world will be meeting here, and there is a standby agreement that is being drawn up for Iraq. And it's going to hopefully be a sizable sum that is going to be given to Iraq. And we're here to also talk to our friends at the IMF and at the World Bank to ensure that any funds raised for Iraq, that our portion in Kurdistan makes its way to Kurdistan. And we've heard some positive response and positive feedback. And again, I think that there is a genuine understanding of the need to help Kurdistan financially, but I am worried that it might be too little too late now. I think it's very important that we expedite this and that we kind of cut through the bureaucracy and get a commitment to support Kurdistan in its time of need.
And your share is 17%, you think, in just like It used to be with
I wouldn't say our share is 17%, and I think this number of 17% has become it's almost become a joke now. We say we don't get 17% of the dust storms of Iraq. We don't get 17% of the IDPs in Iraq. We're not getting 17% of the war of ISIS. So why should we keep getting 17% of the funds that are appropriated for Iraq? And we never get we don't even get 17% of the budget of Iraq. Whenever we used to get our budget allocations, it was always to the tune of 10, 11%. So the 17 is a mythical figure that just doesn't exist anymore, and we don't want it to exist even in our official discussions. We have financial difficulties. There's a clear number that we need. There's a clear number that we're in debt. There is a clear number of projects in Kurdistan that have come to a complete halt because of our financial crisis, because of our liquidity crisis. We have over 4,000 projects that have come to a complete halt in Kurdistan. And this, anyone knows, this is the driver of our economic growth, not salaries, not civil servant salaries. So we have focused the last 2 years of our efforts to make sure that we make salaries on time, but have somewhat neglected the real driver to our economic growth, which is the private sector and capital investment. So it's important that and this is some of our discussions with the international organizations, is how can we benefit from the assistance that's given to Iraq to restart some of these projects that could ultimately reactivate our economy.
I have another question, very specific one, but because it's so specific, I want to ask you. It comes from Nina Shea, I think, from the Hudson Institute. She's in the overflow room. It's about the rule of law in Kurdistan. She says Kurdistan has been very generous to the Christians fleeing ISIS in Nineveh. However, Christians in Nahla, in Dohuk province, are voicing protests that some of the prominent Kurds have illegally expropriated their land and are building on it. And the Kurdish government has not responded to these complaints. Can you ensure that they will be reviewed?
I can assure that their case will be reviewed. I'm the Kurdish government. I am not aware of this case, so I'm happy to look into this case when I go back.
Well, you come to Washington, you get things done.
Okay, there you go. Thank you, Nina, for your question.
The gentleman, yeah, over there, the one with the white shirt. Yeah. You have a white shirt.
Hi, Mr. Qubad. Since everybody speak about Sunni, I'm a Sunni, so.
Can you identify yourself?
Tai Badri from Iraqi Monitor. The collision between Kurdish and Shiites is near to be the end. Since your representative in the parliament get beaten up last night with the Shiite parliament members. Now, my question is, how close to be a coalition with Arab Sunni in order to get benefit from Iraq as in general? Second question, the size of Kurdistan and the population of Kurdistan is like the size of Jordan. And the Jordan, and you are the same, you are on front line with the fight with the terrorists. My question to you is why Kurdistan take a role like Jordan towards Iraqi Sunni people? I never see you visit Saudi Arabia. Why not? Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't think a little scrap in Parliament is going to bring an end to a Shiite Kurdish coalition. Parliaments scrap all the time, and especially in Iraq, it's become quite common for people to throw things at each other. It's democracy in action, right?
We can use that in textbooks now as a definition of democracy.
Democracy in action, if you could. Yesterday was water bottles. I'm worried today there might be other things, so hopefully. So I think that there's been a lot of things over the years historically that have bound Shiites and Kurds together. There's no doubt about that. There's a historic sense of mutual oppression, a historic sense of mutual struggle, and underground movements and fighting and opposing successive governments in Iraq, which on the flip side has always been, some of these issues have always been a source of tension between Sunnis and Kurds, because Sunnis and Kurds have always had geographical clashes. We've always lived in much closer proximity to each other than Shiites and Kurds. So And I mean, look, it's quite clear. I think that 13 years after the overthrow of the regime, we're finally starting to hear things from the Sunni community that are new, right? Autonomy, federalism, these are new things. I remember you and I have had some discussions about centralism versus decentralization back in the years when I was serving here. So the fact that if there are other common points of agreement between Kurds and Sunnis, I think that will lead to a stronger relationship between Kurds and Sunnis, not necessarily to the detriment of the relationship between Kurds and Shiites. We should, if we could manage a relationship with Iran and the United States at the same time, I'm sure we can manage a relationship between Sunnis and Shiites at the same time. So,
How good is that relationship with Iran then?
it's, look, we're living in a neighborhood. Iran is our neighbor, and they've been an ally in the war against ISIS. They've been America's ally in the war against ISIS.
All the way in the back, please.
Bakhair Bek Qubad, thank you. Rabin Pasha, founder of Middle Eastern Entrepreneurs Dreams, working on youth employment and entrepreneurship ecosystem. Qubad, you've been a champion of economic reform and of engaging private sector. And also keeping in mind that the current situation in Kurdistan with the over-reliance on the public sector that you yourself and the Prime Minister have been trying to get away from, and the vast majority of the population, 70% being under 30. What are your thoughts on engaging private sector and opportunities for the United States and other private sector around the world in working in Kurdistan in the future, as well as the role in employing youth and creating an ecosystem of rebuilding the economy and that social contract and development in Kurdistan? Thank you.
Well, this current crisis has highlighted many shortcomings of our government, both administratively but also in terms of our outlooks and our policies. So this over-dependence on the public sector has really crowded out the private sector from being effective in Kurdistan. So now we have an opportunity. We're not letting this crisis go to waste. We're using this crisis to review some of our previous assumptions. One area, for example, is electricity. Right now in electricity, power generation is done by the private sector, but transmission, distribution, collection is all public sector, and we're doing a lousy job at it. In 2015, we had spent about $3.5 billion to power Kurdistan, but we were only able to collect about $250 million. That you don't need to be a smart economist to figure out that's a bad deal. So we're now working with the World Bank and others to try to extract Kurdistan from the electricity sector, and that obviously is going to be transferred over to the private sector. So there's going to be greater private sector involvement in a key sector such as electricity. The same could happen for water utility companies and so forth. And again, when you've got an invigorated private sector, then you have a much more attractive place for the youth of Kurdistan to go and work in. And at the same time, it's been so attractive to come and work for the government because you used to get paid a good salary. You get all these allowances, multitude of different allowances which are like bonuses onto your base salary. And there's been very little kind of, let's say, strictness on work ethic and hours of work, which obviously in the private sector there's much greater accountability to work. So now it's less attractive to work in the public sector in Kurdistan because of this crisis. And I'm speaking to some of the employment agencies in Kurdistan, and I'm hearing very interesting anecdotes of more and more government officials going to these employment centers to learn some soft skills and computer skills and language skills and administrative skills, which is giving me a sense that people are starting to look for work outside the government sphere. This is something that we're going to encourage. But again, as a government, we have to realize what our limitations are. We have to get out of trying to micromanage the economy. Economies are alive and they need space to grow. And everyone is noticing that as people's incomes have dropped, so have the price of commodities, foodstuffs, so the price of goods and services have also dropped, and they didn't need the government to go and bring prices down. Things ultimately adjust to the environment. So that's our vision. That's not an easy thing to get to switch from an overly dependent public sector to something that is a much more balanced sector. It's not easy. Some things are going to require legislative changes, some things are going to require political changes, and some things are going to just require a change in culture of how we actually do things and get things done. But we're starting.
Just as a last follow-up on this, other than oil and gas, what is it that you think the Kurdistan could be competitive in? I mean, what is it that it could sell to the outside world, to its neighbors?
Well, first of all, I think power. Power is something that we will always have a competitive edge over our neighbors, and also within Iraq. So we could become a net exporter of power. That's our goal. We can provide and sell power to the rest of Iraq, which is our goal. We're working on that. Turkey, it's no secret that Turkey has major shortages of power, and they need power, whether it's just the gas that could be turned to power or actual power that could come from Kurdistan. So that is something, that is a sector that could no longer be a sector that is a drain on our resources, but actually could be a sector that could generate significant revenues for our region. I think we've long talked up the agricultural potential of Kurdistan. There's no secret that Kurdistan is very fertile and is rich in water and rich in fertile soil. But again, agriculture requires a fundamental shift in our mindset, where historically we've had a very socialist outlook, and we've told farmers exactly what to grow and how many cucumbers we want from them and how many tomatoes we want from them, and we need to get out of that. We need to let markets dictate what is grown, and how we then as the government can come and support some of those issues. So agriculture is a natural sector that could be not only a major employer for Kurdistan, but also another source of revenue for Kurdistan. Tourism is, whether it's cultural tourism, religious tourism, adventure tourism, for the region, for Iraq, it's the potential is there, and it's probably one of the easiest sectors that we can develop. We've had over the years, before ISIS, a steady stream of tourists from Iraq and even from the region. And the one that interests me personally, and I think the one that I see that in years to come we'll see more of, is IT. We have a very young population in Kurdistan, a relatively tech-savvy population in Kurdistan, a multilingual population in Kurdistan. So Arabic speakers, Kurdish, English, and Farsi, and Turkish speakers. So combining those potentials together is something that really could become a sector, not only to service the Kurdish companies that are growing in Kurdistan, but also to providing services beyond Kurdistan's borders. We just got the domain .krd announced, so we've made it to the global Webistan, right? So virtual Kurdistan is up. Right?
Well, on that note, Qubad, I would like to thank you very much for coming here. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center. And hopefully next year you'll come with better results and better news. And
I look forward to it.
And we'll have you here again. Thank you.
Thanks, Henri.